So welcome back, everybody, to this. This is our conversation with a really fantastic panel of keynote speakers. I'm going to start by briefly introducing them all, and then each person will speak for a few minutes about their lectures. Then we will move on to taking questions via the chat. And of course, if you want to kind of add some nuance what you're asking or respond a little bit more, you can unmute yourself. But let me go ahead and introduce our speakers. First we have, and these are, by the way, these are very shortened bios. Each one of these people has very long, impressive bios with so many things that they've done. But that is online, and I'm just gonna really shorten it for the sake of time. Brand Nicol is Professor of English Literature and the Head of School of Literature and Languages at the University of Surrey, UK. His books include Postmodern Fiction, An Introduction, and Iris Murdoch, The Retrospective Fiction. Victoria Camblin is a writer, editor, art historian, and curator. She's currently the executive editor of 032C magazine in Berlin, Germany. And Shuman Basar is a writer, editor, and curator. He's the co-author of The Age of Earthquakes, A Guide to the Extreme Present, which he co-authors with Douglas Coupland and Hans Ulrich Obrist. So we're just delighted to have all of you with us. And I mentioned where Victoria and Bran were, but not where Shuman is. Shuman, you can tell us when. Why don't you start with your brief, kind of a few words about your presentation, and you can also tell us where you are.
Sure. Hi. Good evening. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. Firstly, I want to thank you, Mary. I want to thank Andy and Diletta. It's been a real pleasure over the last several months to get to know you and to see the process of this coming together. It's been very moving, and thank you for involving me in that. So I am currently in Dubai, and actually virtually I'm in our exhibition called The Age of You, which has been curated by myself and by Douglas and Hans Ulrich Obrist, which is on show at the Jameel Art Center in Dubai. And I'm usually also living in Berlin, which is where Victoria is now, but obviously conditions of pandemia have halted that somewhat. So a little bit about, I guess, what I chose to deal with in the presentation. I called it From the Extreme Present to the Extreme Self via Generation X. I've had the pleasure of knowing Doug for close to 15 years now, and I consider him someone that started out as a distant icon, who I knew through his books. And the first book for me was Girlfriend in a Coma. So that was 1997 when that came out. And then a decade later, I got to meet him, and we instantly became very close friends. I consider him a confidant, but also importantly, a collaborator. He even gave me a picture-perfect mid-century modernist house to live in and to write in about a decade ago. And so I was his next-door neighbor for a good part of a year in West Vancouver. And this was around the time he was writing his biography on Marshall McLuhan. And FYI, the guest before me was one half of OMD, of the band OMD. So I've been very spoiled by Doug, by his friendship, as has anyone that knows him and loves him. So with our friend Hans Ulrich Obrist, the three of us have been what I would call an endless trialogue, which has resulted in countless events, an exhibition that I just mentioned here behind me, The Age of You, and also 2 books the Age of Earthquakes, A Guide to the Extreme Present, which Mary mentioned, and of course the part of the title of this conference comes from. And also importantly, plug, shameless plug, our sequel to that book, which is called The Extreme Self. And this will be coming out late next month, early June, depending on your regions. And we've been working on that for the last few years. And so the exhibition, so what you see behind me are actually pages from the book, which we blew up to kind of poster sizes. And so the exhibition is partly walking through the insides of the new book, and also a dozen other installations and works from artists and designers and technologists. So what I've done in my talk, which is relatively brief, which feels appropriate given our interest in acceleration and proceleration, is I've outlined how our ideas, such as the extreme present and the extreme self, can in fact be traced back to Generation X, and how what continues to motivate the three of us, and the nature of our kind of this trialogue, is applying a very similar kind of wide-eyed magical thinking upon the contemporary condition. And so one of the things I say in my talk is that the transformations of the present are always paradoxical. So the present has actually been stretched out. So there's the recent present, the extreme present, and the near present. And because the present has been stretched out into such a territory, it requires these different modes of analysis, which could be anthropological, philosophical, but also, as I say, a sort of form of magical thinking that's important. So what I also wanted to show, maybe more reflexively in the talk, is the way in which words and images are equally important in our shared pursuits. Sometimes pushing words so that they become images, and also insisting that images are a kind of writing. Now, this is something that Victoria expands beautifully and with great kind of eloquence and also context in her talk. So if you haven't seen that, I do recommend that. And I think the relationship I want to make to Brand's presentation here is that where Brand's talking about fiction, and particularly the sort of the evolution of Doug's fiction in the last 8-9 years, is that I've thought of both The Age of Earthquakes and also our new book, The Extreme Present, The Extreme Self, as novels. And so we actually call the new book a graphic novel, or a new kind of graphic novel. And I also thought of, I mean, The Age of Earthquakes is different things. Hans Ulrich would describe it as a portable exhibition. But for me, I've always, in my mind, thought of it as a kind of new kind of novel. So that's the link I'd like to make to Bran here. And then the last thing that I do in my talk is, and I think very nicely already brought this up in the chat earlier, but is to ask the question whether generations should be strictly defined by timelines anymore, or whether there are different ways in which generations should be kind of metricized or aggregated or identified. And so that's something I look forward to talking about, because that's already come up already. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Victoria.
Hi. Yeah, to repeat Schumann, thank you so much, Mary, and everybody, and Diletta and everyone who's organized the conference. It's such a cool program, and visibly a very cool audience as well. So it's a total privilege and a pleasure. Yeah, so my talk which is called When Words Are Images, or When Words Are Pictures, sorry, set out to address what Shumon just set up as this sort of fluid relationship between mediums that's evidenced in Doug's work and also kind of in the general cultural flow of things in this post-digital context. But what was interesting was that in kind of unpacking that in my talk, I found myself thinking, first of all, talking about magic, but also talking about time. And, you know, and Doug's work, which is flagged by Bran and by Shumon, and in my talk, sort of really grapples with our sense of time, or like even timiness, to kind of throw in another coinage. And what's interesting is in this effort to kind of sort of map out generational trends and things that happen on a linear chronology, where we end up seemingly is the total dissolution of our sense of linear time. And I found that quite interesting. And of course, it's really very of the moment, of the current moment, with the COVID moment and us sort of being here a year on and being like, where did the year go? But then looking back on Doug's work, you realize he's been really working through this issue for decades, I think. And how strange it was for me to kind of approach this with a pretty strict idea of making a point about not worrying too much about the distinction of, you know, the textual or the visual or whatever. And to suddenly find myself in a place where we're suddenly also just like, you know, generations and time, we can't really deal with that anymore, even though Doug's practice is so rooted in defining those things. And I think that's so interesting, that in parsing out and in trying to establish these sort of nomenclatures, we actually end up liquefying them somehow. And I think, and I said that in my talk about the you know, the medium is the message slogan. That verb is not a rearrangement of a hierarchy or not a definitional kind of actor, but it's actually a dissolving one. It creates this kind of equivalency where we get lost on this linear chronology. And in parallel, we get lost on a disciplinary distinction. And so, yeah, and this all related to things that I had kind of approached in many ways and in various contexts, you know, as an editor, and historically, sort of how do we fuse media and work between them in order to kind of create new worlds or build space or community and so on. And yeah, the realization that I had with Doug's work was that in this parsing out, we really get to that point of kind of complete conflation, and not necessarily in a, I mean, I think in a very productive way, in a sense that's very, very resonant now, and seems to be, if I may, even coming to kind of a very demonstrative head of some kind. And yeah, and the great thing, so of course Schuman's talk deals with this temporality too, and so does Bran's. And I thought about addressing the definitions that Bran's talk addressed, but I didn't. So I was quite pleased to see that you got into that milieu as well. But again, it's this kind of thing in defining, sort of in defining smoopidity and these types of things, you end up dissolving distinctions as well. So I think that that's kind of an interesting alchemy, if I may go back to sort of a magical terminology on it.
Oh, thank you so much, Victoria. And Bran, could you say a few words?
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Shumon and Victoria, for what you've already said. I mean, my mind's already racing, and that's not just because of the mention of OMD. I can't get an OMD out of my head right now, but thanks so much for the invitation to take part in this conference. Thanks to Andy, to Mary and Diletta. It's a really important, momentous conference. It's wonderful to be part of it. And I think the format, in a sense, even though it's been kind of thrust upon us, is somehow appropriate, you know, for the kind of topics that we're talking about, because the situation we're in now does seem like a crystallization of the conditions of the extreme present as we've had to experience them or come to experience them over the past 5-10 years in particular. So I'm based at the University of Surrey. I'm a professor of English literature here. I am literally here at the university. There are still some students around, but it's a very kind of empty place compared with what it's supposed to be. I work mainly on the novel, but I've also written on cultural studies and film. And I'm interested overall, I suppose, in the contemporary moment and that kind of work, and how we got here from there, depending on the particular context or the particular text that we might be thinking about. Really struck by your phrase, Victoria, timiness. If I've got that correct, I mean, that sounds, it reminds me, you know, in a knee-jerk response, it reminds me of Stephen Calder's notion of truthiness, you know, which is somewhere between truth and then falsity, that had the ring of truth that's not necessarily true, term that he mentioned in relation to politics. So I wonder if timeness is the same, that it's not time as we understand it philosophically or even physically, but we inhabit that kind of zone of timeliness. That'd be something that'd be really interesting to talk about. To briefly go over my paper, or to give an introduction to my paper, there were two main contexts, I think, that I was interested in or working within. One was this question of the theory of the extreme present. That's why I've always loved Douglas Coupland's work. Schumann, I loved your paper. I'm really looking forward to the Extreme Self book. It's a shame it's not out in time, but you've given us a fascinating glimpse of this. And I think it's kind of a necessary follow-up, I think, from all the questions that I have about the extreme present, about the age of earthquakes. So that's one context. It really is. I've always been interested in trying to capture and pinpoint the essence of the moment that we're in now. I've always been interested in kind of periodizing terms like postmodernism and post-postmodernism. Not everyone is, but it's precisely because of this attempt to try and explain who we are now and why. So that's one context, the temporal one. The second one is the context of the novel. What is distinctive about the novel? You know, as a literary theorist, I always think it's important to remember what is important about the novel, what is distinctive, even to the extent of going back to the old formalist definition of literariness. You know, there's something that only the novel can do, or only literature can do, that distinguishes it from other media. So I'm interested in what the role of the novel is now, given that it's such an elastic and flexible form. And Schumann, I'm delighted because you've already answered the question I was dying to ask you, and that is, would you have described The Age of Earthquakes as a novel? And I'm really excited that you said yes. You know, so that's really interesting to me, because it sort of reads like a novel, but of course that means we have to define the novel anew. We may not have time for this, but that's certainly something that really interests me about the Age of Earthquakes. In my actual paper, I talk about the age of smoothidity, and I'm perhaps taking liberties with that term, because what interests me most about that is that it implies a self-reflexivity about the moment we live in. And I think that's very typical of our age. And actually, I've become increasingly interested in the distinction between reflexivity in a sociological sense, which is a reflex action that you're not necessarily aware of, but you're almost part of this machine, and self-reflexivity, which has an element of pause and an element of critique. And I think that's what I like about smoothidity. It captures the fact that we have this, that we're on the margins or the boundaries between reflexivity and self-reflexivity in our age at the moment. So that's what I start with in the paper. Then I look at this notion of the extreme present and try and put this in context of some thinkers that I've also been interested in, such as Frederick Jameson or Mark Fisher or Gilles Lipovetsky. Then sketch out very briefly, kind of scandalously quickly, how recent fiction might be shaped by this sense of the extreme present. But I do so in order to focus on the category of translate, which I think has enormous potential, actually. That's Coupland's term for novels which contain a multiplicity of narratives, depicting different worlds and timescales, and crossing genre, kind of trans-genre. I think that's a really interesting term for the kind of fiction that's often produced now. And in the final section, I turn to Coupland's work itself, and thinking about this question of what the novel is now and how the recent work actually relates to this expanded definition or updated definition of the novel. But also, I think, to pinpoint what I'm describing as a kind of coolness, in the kind of Baudrillardian term, that I felt reading the Age of Earthquakes that I almost longed for a position on this. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? And I think what the strength of the book is, it doesn't actually do this. It presents us with the world as it is, and leaves us to draw the kind of conclusions I think from that. So that's really where I go in my paper, and I'm really looking forward to what we might discuss going forward just now. Thank you.
Sorry, folks. We were having a little trouble hearing Bran, so I was just trying to finagle and see if but thank you very much, Bran. And I want to tell everybody that you can go ahead and put your questions in the chat. And I'm wondering if it might help with the sound on Bran's end if all of us, the four of us, mute ourselves unless we're speaking. That might help. I don't know if that might be an issue. But yes, go ahead and please put some questions up. And I think I'm going to start with, I'm just thinking, I mean, my mind is spinning after the last panel we had, and then connecting some of the ideas with all that you've just said. And and especially I'm fascinated with Schumann just saying that these two books are graphic novels, that they are novels, because I really, and I feel a bit, I hope I'm not being a one-trick pony here, because I asked about narrative in the last panel, but it's just in my brain because it's come up with all three of you. And I'm thinking about all the way back to Polaroids from the Dead, when Doug talks about denarration and not feeling part of a story, and in Generation X, the talk about being isolated little cool moments, the kind of fragmentation and the desire to want to be part of a story. And he says that when we don't have ideology or religion, and there's no larger, so their story is connected to community. And then that's really interesting, because I'm thinking about Victoria talking about memes creating this kind of online community where you're on the inside or the outside. If you get the meme, it's a reference to an entire set of ideas and community. But I'm just wondering, and then of course the denarration is also mentioned in the Age of Earthquakes, I believe. So yeah, so I'm thinking about, yeah, and I'm also thinking about the relationship to the self with Schumann's phrasing emotional capitalism. No, is that your emotional capitalism? Brand's talking about the notion of deselfing. Of course, the idea of having a story relates to community and self. So I guess I'm going to ask right now, I'm just trying to pull these things together in my mind, is it seems to me when Coupland first talked about denarration, it seemed to be a kind of a lament. And so many of his books were about the desire to be part of a story. So my question is, in this more recent work of Coupland's, with the use of slogans, with a novel that, as Brand says, the contents of the Age of Earthquakes, it's more like the textual commentary brought into the center. So is this a type of re-narration that looks very different? I'm wondering, is denarration still lamented, or is this a type of re-narration in this new kind of very much focus on the text and image together? So I don't, a lot of stuff, but I'm hoping to give you something to maybe to respond to on that.
I mean, maybe I'll say something first. I mean, the big difference, and this is what I allude to in my presentation, is, I mean, most of those well, certainly Generation X, when it comes out in 1991, how many people on Earth would have even heard of the word internet yet at that point? So, it's clearly from the, it's sort of pre-internet brain era. And so I think, I agree with you, Mary, but I think that the reason of the shift is, not simply only, but largely because we enter into the digital world.
Yeah.
And so, you could say that, 1991, Doug writes in about mostly 1990s and 91, where, it was still in a sort of reasonably golden age of postmodernism. To go back to the earlier conversations about pop art, I think one of the reasons Doug loves pop art is because of the way in which collage works, because of the way in which, disparate things can exist in a kind of proximity that they were never intended to. And, and I think, and obviously that becomes like a hallmark of, what we think of like the postmodern novel, the postmodern movie, or the postmodern TV show, etc. Right? And so that sense of, what Brand then picks up on, which is, I'm sure many of you know, the kind of backstory of Generation X, but it's very important, right, to know that it was commissioned as a piece of nonfiction, right? It was commissioned as essentially a kind of Gen X version of Peter York's The Sloane Rangers. So it was, and York's famous book from like 83 which attempts to codify this new social, there's like new, basically the yuppies of like Southwest London. And so St. Martin's Press, asked Doug to do something similar for this generation who were turning 30 in around 1990. And, Doug goes literally, like a father of the desert, he gets a healthy advance, he goes to the desert in Nevada, literally shacks himself up for 9 months. This is important if we're talking about like religious, biological symbolism. 9 months, he basically doesn't leave, and he comes out with a novel, quote unquote, and the publishers, they were aghast. They didn't want it. They didn't want to publish it. They said, this is not a novel, this is not, they wanted nonfiction. So they said, this is not a nonfiction book. We don't know what this is, And so the very early story, or the very early gestation of Generation X is actually very fraught because of its in-betweenness. Because as a genre, it doesn't seem to be either a novel or a piece of nonfiction. They don't know what it is, And as we know, the original format is this strange sort of square format that allows for the marginalia, that allows for the images, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I think all of that comes from a pre-internet notion of the postmodern, right? Or the neo-modern. And I think there was a certain sense of lament, you could say, about the denarration, the crumminess of the McJob life, et cetera, et cetera. But I think after, once we become neurologically, biologically, pathologically interneted, that's simply the way in which our lives exist today. That's simply what realism feels like today, right? So realism is disconnected. It seems to speed up and slow down in a completely random way, right? So I think there is a shift, and I think one of the great, qualities of Doug. I think we can all name people who were casualties of the transition from the pre-internet to the internet age. The great novelists of the postmodern era that suddenly, I think, looked completely redundant as soon as we moved into a digital age. Not the case for Doug, right? Like, he was able to surf with every single change that happened. And so by the time we're where we are now, I think denarration, while it's the same word, it's moral, you could say it's moral and affective meaning is different than it was 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, that really relates back to, well, I'm thinking about Generation X and the neologisms and the images on the sides. And I mean, I tend to, when I teach the novel and think about, I always think of it as a kind of metafiction where Doug is making these ironic commentary. It's, it's almost like, and so that in between fiction and nonfiction is fascinating. And then with Brand talking about how that's moved into the center. So I guess now I'm thinking the root of the question I was asking, I finally figured it out, is has the internet provided a new capacity for re-narration? And I think that might relate a lot to what Victoria spoke about with themes. And so I would love to hear what you think about that, Victoria. Oh, you're muted. There we go.
Yeah, there's a lot of kind of vectors here, but I think I can tie them all together actually. So like, Mary, when you posed your initial question, you spoke about not feeling like you're part of a story. And that was something I kind of tapped on too, is sort of like the community building ability of the meme is like to tell a story about that lack of being able to tell a story, right? And similarly, then, Schumann got into, for example, the backdrop of Generation X, which was supposed to be about real life and then became a novel, but also like real kind of equals not real. And which made me think of, I talk about advertising in my talk. I even quote like a Sprite ad and stuff and think different and what have you, but the dominant language now in that type of messaging is you don't just do brand messaging, you do storytelling now. So that's very much been kind of re-ingrained into a brand narrative, but I think also in terms of this like individual impulse, right? Like to kind of find the story, and maybe the not having the story is the story, and that's what creates a community of kind of relatable peers, which can go in, all sorts of conceivable directions of consumership, of, along the political spectrum and so on. But this idea that like, suddenly one's personal, professional life has to do with some type of narrative is quite interesting. It has to do with a story, which of course goes back to this idea of like, what the hell is a novel now? In terms of metafiction, now we have autofiction that's very kind of, that reads like a really good Twitter thread sometimes. So this idea of narrative, and it goes, to me, this also goes back to this question of generational distinction or definition, which is also narrative. And my hang up that really crystallized for me this last year, for example, was the narrative of the new and neo and things like this, which I realize is like a way we tell a story about progress around things that maybe are quite the same. And so, you could, neo-fascism is like, do we need the neo actually always? Or neoclassicism, like, could also be termed classicism, and like also new version of which type of classicism. So I was just thinking about it, like, wow, we do a lot of work rebranding on personal levels, on social media, for example. And the examples are manifold in the last year. You don't need to look beyond, the last 14 months or whatever to like really see this in action. But yeah, this kind of telling the story of the self, which then could maybe even be a novel, but then could also be a product, but then could also be a lifestyle change, or could be like an electoral result, or, you know, but this kind of, this idea of how we narrate things and the anxiety around that is quite interesting for me. And I think there's a lot of that in what we see in Doug's work, and I think Schumann's point about the kind of the creation story of Generation X, which I mean, God, the Generation X gives us, you know, would we even be talking about millennials and Gen Z without that terminology? I mean, it's pretty major as a narrative. And when I was reading some really old, like reviews or back of the book summaries of Generation X, that had, it was people born between 65 and 85. And then I was born in the 80s. They gave us Gen Y for a minute. Schumann's heard me rant about this. They gave us Gen Y for a minute, and now mostly you're just millennial now. And they keep kind of shifting the narratives around it, but always within this like really kind of this framework of a desire for proximity that needs to be branded and narrated, that I think Doug is always questioning. I think, yeah, what did Schumann say? An unintended proximity also, I think was the term. Or like there is kind of an ad hoc quality to it, which goes hand in hand with a traditional fictional format, right? I mean, that we can re-narrate these things. We can re-narrate the significance of a birth year, even these things that are located on a calendar, like, you know, on a typical calendar. And I think that's quite interesting. I'm not sure if that responds to the direction you were hoping it would go in, though, Mary.
Oh, it's great. It's great. I mean, I went in many directions because there's so much, there's so many constellations here. But thank you. I'm going to read a few comments about storytelling that maybe Bran could, they're not really questions, but I think they're kind of bouncing off of what we've been talking about. So who is this? Ben says storytelling feels like a life-saving activity. 1001 Nights hinges on an ability to string a story in such a way that would save a life. Girlfriend in a Coma offers all the main characters a chance to relive their lives with a hope to change the ending. Yeah, that's interesting because, of course, in that novel, you have that tension between the life-saving powers of technology and the soul-deadening powers of technology, and this idea of recreating. And then someone, who else? Chris said, it's interesting that in 1991, Generation X and pre-internet era, that the character Claire says, it's not healthy to live life as a succession of isolated little cool moments. Fast forward to today, where a majority of social media appears to be just that, posting isolated cool moments. And then someone else mentioned the story feature on Instagram, which I know Schumann is the major practitioner of using story. I mean, if you want to see some amazing use of stories, follow Schumann on Instagram. And so, and stringing them together. Is there a connection? Is there not a connection? So Bran, I think maybe you could chime in with, you know, relating this back to the idea of the novel and storytelling in fiction and in nonfiction, and even maybe how that relates to these new forms of graphic novels.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Is the volume better here? Is this a better?
Yes,
much better.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've switched mic, so that seems to be better. So apologies for my rambling and high-pitched opening. Yeah, the question of narration in the novel, I mean, before thinking about the novel in particular, I'd be interested in whether narration itself is what is of most value, or whether it is the reception of narration. You know, do you need a listener or do you need a reader for your narrative to actually be meaningful? I wonder, I mean, and Schumann, you could say more about this. I wonder if in the age of earthquakes, the implication is that re-narration, there's a kind of reflex kind of narration that everyone does, but that isn't valuable, but there's a different kind of narration. I'm trying not to think too much of psychoanalysis, but in psychoanalysis, there's the patient can tell the story repeatedly, but it's only when it's told in a certain way and understood in a certain way that it actually has some kind of therapeutic value. And the novel is usually bound up with storytelling, but doesn't have to be. And one of the odd things about the novel, of course, is if you want to define it, you have to just start with the term, which means new. So it's something new. It's a constantly evolving and updating form, which is why I think it's exciting that Shumon, you described The Age of Earthquakes as a novel. It seemed that way to me, but it doesn't fulfill the brief of many of the traditional definitions of the novel. But one original definition of the novel, or it's a recent definition by Catherine Gallagher, relatively recent, and she says the novel came about in the 18th century because people were able to take a virtual experience for truth, and before that wasn't really the case. But it was only when you had a novelist like Fielding and you had very ordinary people who were not real that people were able to see that virtuality as something real. And Gallagher, I think, quite brilliantly links this to the rise of money, as we know it now, where you have an object standing in for value. So I think that's an interesting definition, I think, of the novel and of narrative. It's some kind of virtuality that allows us to experience truth or reality.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We had multiple questions about magic, because that's a word that came up in both Victoria's talk and Schumann's. Your phrasing, I'm trying to find it out here, with the way we think about the present. What did you say? History, anthropology, and magic? Was that the?
Well, I think anthropological, sociological, and magical thinking is required to begin to understand the present. Yeah.
Yes, to begin to understand the present. And then Victoria is talking about, I was fascinated with the way memes work and thinking about a kind of magic or alchemy, and that it seems those things must relate. And then we had another question. Back to Schumann, someone wanted to know that they saw that the extreme self, one of the chapters was it Wizardry and Magic, or what is is that the title?
Yes, it's called Wizards and Charismatics.
Charismatics, okay, that made me think of magic.
Yeah.
And so I think two people were wondering, how are you using the word magic when you talk about understanding the present moment? And I think that might help us think about some of Victoria's comments on alchemy and meme making. And then somebody else asked in relation to this, what I thought would be helpful for maybe Brand to speak to is magical realism. Someone was thinking, would you ever call Coupland's fiction magical realism? And could it relate perhaps to the kind of magic that Victoria and Schumann are talking about? So I'll throw it out there. Schumann, what do you mean by magic?
Well, yeah, the word and the notion come up a few times in our new book, in The Extreme Self. And so, for example, towards the end of the book, there is this chapter called Wizards and Charismatics. And one of basically the thesis here is that what we call technologians. So, and I think Elon Musk is pretty much the pinnacle example here, that technologians are now our magical individuals today, right? And so if you and it's worth saying here that the new book is the first book was an update of Marshall McLuhan's The Medium is the Massage for the 21st century. This time, our guiding book is The Age of Extremes by Eric Hobsbawm. His extraordinary history of the 20th century, of the short 20th century. And what we've done is we've taken the chapter titles from Eric's book and we've used those as a skeleton structure for our new book, but we update them. So we've updated one of his chapters where he did talk about magicians, but he was talking about politicians as magicians, right? The relationship between magic and political thinking, particularly demagoguery, right? In the 20th century. And I mean, both on the left and the right. And so we would think, well, who are the magical individuals today? they're the technologians, right? I mean, they're not only the most wealthy, but they're also the people that that an extraordinary number of people today vest a sense of, it's as though, I mean, if you want to understand science fiction, you don't look at the cinema anymore. You look at Elon Musk's Twitter feed, right? You try and get a grasp on what Google X are doing. And this, I mean, I've been saying recently in the last year that, science fiction is now our late realism. We no longer need to go to culture to look for science fiction. We're simply living in it now, right? So that's one sense in which I mean magic and magic individual. The second would be there's a chapter in the new book called Inner Revolution, and this is looking at how communities of belief are being formed today, and so this connects to what Victoria is saying about community formations. But in particular, we're sort of interested in the resurgence of things that's, are timeline-wise go back thousands of years. So whether it's, I mean, my friends are replacing their shrinks with shamans. The uptake of ayahuasca retreats, the kind of insurgent interest in mushrooms, but also the conflation between astrology, big data, and venture capital, right? Now, all of these things have been on a massive uptake, particularly for millennials and below, right? And also just the general, there's been a new found interest in magical thinking, whether it's Aleister Crowley or, I follow somebody now who uses astrology to tell me when to buy and sell cryptocurrency. And she is like killing it on TikTok and on Instagram now. So, there are many ways in which I feel that because of this sense of like of technological hegemony, right? That it's also producing what seems to be on the surface the opposite, but in fact, I would argue is part of the same continuum, right? Because let's not forget that, as Arthur C. Clarke once said, and historically speaking, any form of technology that couldn't be understood was considered a form of magic, right? Yeah. So the link between technology and magic has always been there. It's nothing new, so.
That's so interesting because of the longstanding link between art and magic. And I'm thinking about the intersection of technology and art that we're seeing in so much of what you all are talking about. That's pretty fascinating. I was also thinking about when you were the beginning of talking technology as magic, it makes me think of Damien Hirst's focus on medicine as the new religion. That's quite, and this is also quite post-secular in a very interesting way that's still very informed by, modernity. So a lot of things go together there. So Victoria, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what Schumann says, or your comments on the magic making memes.
Yeah, thanks for the Arthur C. Clarke reference. I always just credited my high school best friend who has done a lot of ayahuasca since. And she was just like, one day she was just like, think about it, like emails are pretty magic. And I was like, it's telepathic communication. But I mean, historically, one can note rather disturbingly, and this is one of my things, is that in periods of technological acceleration, you also have a popular increase in interest in the occult. So during the Industrial Revolution, Victorian Britons get super into like Egyptology. Tarot actually had been kind of dormant, came back then. You get kind of, there's a Rosicrucianism, sort of occult as in also secrecy. So there's a way of seeing it also potentially, and I don't know if I formulated it quite this way before, but I'm going to give it a shot now. The esoteric is the opposite of exoteric, right? So it's the private communications or the private crystallizations private channels, whereas the exoteric is the public ones. So perhaps as kind of mass communications increase, not only is that kind of magical, but we also then seek sort of a secret social aspect to things, whether that's a vanishing story on Snapchat or a close friends only thing, or like a very legitimate, as we see online now, these like fully anonymous communities, which John Michael Greer, this occultist who I mentioned in my talk, has spoken about at length as, meme magicians, people who really view these tools of text and image as modes of manifesting, of making real certain collective desires. And that's, that's another thing we touch on, to go back to kind of this like text image dichotomy. The combination of text and image and action is like the kind of baseline formula for magical practices, right? I mean, that's what you do. You say something, or you draw something, or you visualize something, and then you change some type of matter, whether that's lighting a candle or whatever, and then it supposedly yields a result. In the same way that in order to send a telegram, that involves the same type of mechanics, or to post something. So there's some very kind of basic parallels that make total sense, even intuitively, from this perspective. And there was a question earlier that we didn't get to before we started talking about storytelling, which was about the hierarchy between the visual and the written, or the visual and the verbal, I think, which I found so interesting because it approached, that particular comment approached it as from the kind of iconoclastic view of the word being higher up in a hierarchy of whether that's sanctity or authority or whatever, than the image. And when I read that comment, I was like, oh yeah, I forgot that was a thing. Because we're so entrenched, and there's been actually some really great literature about this, and also kind of getting away from it. But there's some scholarship about the sort of the supremacy of the visual, and actually even like a modern or postmodern denigration thereof in response to that. And we still seem to be kind of caught up in this binary, which is maybe why we're kind of ending up in this place where it's just like, I just combine them, and let's think of the slogan as a picture and as a word, like NBD, that we can just, obviously it's doing something, and perhaps even beyond that visual, like the part of the Dubai talk from 2012 that I quoted, where Doug is sitting on a panel with Schumann and Hans-Ulrich Obrist, and he thumps on his chair. And he talks about how when he hears thump, he thinks thump, and then thinks about like the placement of the letters for thump. And then at that point, you're just like, why am I talking about text and image right now? Like it's a bit, again, it's that kind of alchemical thing where, yes, I'm aware that there's a material intervention here, hand on seat, or in the case of like posting something, there's like a giant data thing there, and there's a hardware in front of you and all that stuff. But yeah, there's some type of transference. And that gets us to the question of media again. It's the media as medium, as this host for something else, something ineffable, something intangible. And and after a certain point, yeah, the medium is the medium. Also, it's the intermediary. There's something else there, and we're all kind of trying to, and now I'm just babbling, I think. But it goes to the magical realism term made me think of the superpower thing that I also brought up in my talk, where Doug says every time we gain a new superpower, we lose the last one. And that was in his excerpt from the Age of Anxiety Commission for Sharjah, that I cited as was republished in the Financial Times, but he kind of replaces McLuhan's medium with this idea of superpower. So I was thinking supernatural. Well, yeah, all of the infrastructure we've built is supernatural if we're going to go and break it down into those terms. So in a way, we're kind of, yeah, this sort of impulse towards, again, divide, like there's the mundane here, and then there's the magical here, or there's the real stuff here, and then there's the fictional here. It's starting to seem a little bit pointless as a distinction, I think, in terms of how we live in, as how we inhabit these vocabularies, and how we approach technology, and how we talk about how we self-narrate, and how we view the real and the self. Yeah, again, it's I'll just end with another reference to my own talk, which is like that phenomenon. After I wrote it, I thought about it again, and I was like, oh gosh, which is like considering a meme or a story or some kind of characterization as really relatable when you see it, but then also feeling alienated by that. And I can't imagine I'm the only one, but like a similar kind of sensation as looking in a mirror, particularly, or looking in a Zoom even, and feeling like quite alienated by one's own image, even though that's something that you inhabit and that is tangible. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. We're getting so many good comments in the chat, and we're almost out of time. This is going by so quickly. I did want to read one because it relates to all of this and to microserfs it makes me think of. I recently sat in on a discussion group with Jason Lanier, the creator of virtual reality, who remains deeply connected to Silicon Valley. He said his friends who were involved in the foundation of Google saw it as a spiritual endeavor to gather all the data in order to create a new God. That's it makes me think of the bill in microserfs and all of that. But Bran, love your thoughts on this.
Yeah, really fascinating stuff. I mean, I think that we're definitely seeing the rise of magical thinking, you know, in that the kind of Freudian sense, I suppose. It seems to be that once you deregulate narrative and everyone has their story via the internet, and there's no longer official narratives. There is a proliferation of narratives that suggest magical thinking, conspiracy theory, etc. Mm-hmm. Maybe we don't want to get into that topic too much, but just to come back to the question of definitions and magic realism, in a literary sense, or a literary critical sense, magic realist fiction is where the marvelous coexists with the real without any problem at all. You know, whereas many other fictions, when something marvelous happens, it's in the mind of a character, or it's there's a reason for it. So I don't think Coupland's fiction is magic realist in a sense, and it's one of these interesting things. I was really pleased to see the reference to Ballard that I think Niall put in the chat. I mean, Ballard was kind of similar in a sense in that he diagnosed the condition of postmodernity, but wrote in what was essentially a realist style. But you had to look elsewhere for the radical nature. And I think with Doug Coupland's work, you could say it's about characters. His fiction's about characters, it's about their interface with society, is an insight into their consciousness, all of which is classic realist fiction in a sense. But I think it's the meta level which fascinates me, which always has. It is about the inserts and about the footnotes, and it always makes me think of who's speaking. You know, is that the author himself, or is it a version of some kind of official analytical overview? And I think that's the fascinating, distinctive thing in his work.
I just want to sort of jump in and add to that. I mean, I think it may be of interest for people to know this, that I mean, of course, Doug didn't study to be a writer; he studied to be a sculptor. He comes from a visual art background, but his entry point into writing are two artists. I mean, it's Andy Warhol. It's the philosophy of Andy Warhol, A to B and back again, and it's the truisms of Jenny Holzer, right? So you could say it's the sort of it's the deadpan brutal confession, you know, social anthropology of Warhol. That sense, you know, Doug is phenomenal. You know, he's as interested as in the waitress that will come and serve you, your spaghetti bolognese, as he is in, some billionaire that is on the headlines today. I mean, and I'm very, very serious about this. Like, I've never met someone whose interest in people is so thoroughly democratic, and so I think he gets that from Warhol. Then he gets the kind of, what Victoria's been talking and writing about, which are these like the sort of the tendency towards hyper compressed distillations of words on page or on screen, right? I mean, those of you who know Jenny Holz's truism will know that somehow she's able to somehow invoke like the entirety of humanity in like 6 words or something. And so, I think those are his writing godparents, and I think it's important that they come from the art world, right? Ballard is very important. I mean, but really the people that he says made him want to write are Andy Warhol and Jenny Holzer. And then the other thing I want to add, and for you, Bran, this is interesting because, thinking about the evolution of Doug's writing over the last 30 years. But I asked him once about, because I say my entry point was Girlfriend in a Coma. And so when I was his neighbor, I asked him about that novel. And I was beginning to write my own novel at that point. And then he said, he was astonished at how many notes I had, how meticulously I was trying to plan my novel. And then I asked him about Girlfriend in a Coma, and he said that was the last book that he wrote that was a notebook novel, right? So, and that meant that up to that point, like many of us, he kept notebooks full of research. And then when he sat down to write, he sort of, he tried to do it in a schematic way. So there was a certain amount of architectural planning to the books up to Girlfriend in a Coma. And it's interesting because you can see that there is very strong structure in Girlfriend in a Coma, as there are in the previous books, right? In the early works. After that point, he then told me, he said, after that point, I write the first sentence, I write the second, I write the third, and I hope that I keep writing enough sentences till I get to the end. And I think you can see in the last few novels, particularly, they feel like they're sort of like interior monologues. And the distinctions between characters they're very thinly veiled. I mean, it's Doug talking, right? Like if you were to have dinner with Doug, that's kind of how he would talk. He would put on a funny accent, and then he would talk to you in one of those characters, But I find this very fascinating. I think you would start stringing these things together, like what were the influences that went into writing? The fact that I can't remember, his agent or editor told him to stop making art in 1991 because he wouldn't be taken seriously as an author, because back in those days you couldn't do these two things at the same time. So he stopped making art for a decade. But of course, he sublimated his art practice in his fiction, right? So that's why the typographic experiments, the fascination with fonts, the visualization of words on the page, this is coming from someone who's schooled in a visual arts background. This is not your normal like fiction writer who did an MFA, right? So anyway, Bran, I thought you might find that interesting in terms of genealogy.
That's really fascinating, Shumon. Really helpful, actually. It makes me want to. I mean, it's kind of speaking to Doug through you, but it makes me wonder what his next moves are going to be, what his faith is in the novel. Whether if that's not too grand a kind of notion, or asking to define categories, which may not be the right thing to do.
Well, thank you all so much. We've gone over time a little bit, but it just flew by because it's such a great conversation. I think we could talk and listen all day. So let's all give thanks to our keynotes. Yay!
Thank you, Mary. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was
Thank you
fantastic.
so much. And also, I just want to give a shout out to everybody commenting.
Yeah.
I'm loving it. We've got Graeber, we've got the postmodernist always rings twice. I could keep going. I mean, tweet at us maybe, or it's awesome. Thank you so much.
I just said to someone
Really?
earlier, I guess I should have anticipated that the most interesting people in the world would come to a Douglas Coupland conference. So it should have known that this would be such a great vibe going here. But thank you so much. And we are going to take a break and we will be back. It'll be 7 UK time.